So what if the only way to actually grow, like really grow, isn't to add positive things to your life, but to violently tear your current foundation apart?
Oh, wow. Starting with the heavy-hitting questions today.
Right. Because, I mean, we live in a culture that is just completely obsessed with life hacks and additions. We want, more sunlight, better habits, more knowledge, basically premium organic fertilizer for our minds.
Yeah, the self-improvement treadmill.
Exactly. But today's source material suggests something radically different. It argues that until you experience absolute foundational destruction, all that so-called growth is just, well, it's just expensive fertilizer washing down a concrete drain.
It is a profound disruption of how we typically view progress. I mean, we assume growth is a linear equation, right?
Yeah.
Positive inputs equal positive outputs.
Right. You add good stuff, you get good results.
Exactly. But the text we're examining today introduces this massive friction point into that equation. It argues that subtraction, and specifically the shattering of the ego, has to precede any meaningful addition.
And look, if you are joining us for this deep dive, it means you're always looking for those paradigm shifts. You want to understand the mechanisms behind the ideas without getting bogged down by information overload.
Which is so easy to do these days.
Oh, for sure. So today, our source material is a message delivering on December 8th, 2024. It's by Josh Sexton, and it's titled, What is Good Ground?
And our mission today is to completely redefine a classic biblical metaphor. I mean, we're looking at the idea of soil representing the human condition, but we're moving far beyond the basic, Sunday school interpretation.
The one where being good ground just means avoiding bad
Right,
habits.
exactly. We're diving into this stark claim that destruction, which the source calls brokenness, is actually the active catalyst required for any real utility.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to get to the destruction part, we first have to look at how Sexton redefines the baseline.
Yeah, he really flips it on its head.
He does, because if you grew up around this text like the parable of the sower from Matthew 13, you already know the classic lineup. You have the wayside ground, which is the busy, compacted soil. You have the stony ground, and you have the thorny ground. And we usually just treat these as a basic checklist of what not to do.
Which is, quite frankly, an incredibly passive way to read the text.
Right.
And Sexton bypasses that passive reading entirely. He points out that the wayside is just the necessary traffic of life. School, work, the daily grind. It's not inherently evil.
It's just compacted by volume.
Exactly. And his definition of the stony ground is really fascinating because it focuses on mechanism, not morality.
Yeah, that really caught my attention. He uses the specific example of playing video games or watching sports for 4 or 5 hours a day.
Right, and he isn't claiming those hobbies are inherently toxic or sinful.
No, he's talking about the physics of displacement. Like, if a massive neutral stone takes up 80% of the real estate in a planter box, the roots of whatever you are trying to grow literally have nowhere to go.
Because the space is already occupied.
Right, it's an issue of volume, not villainy.
That distinction is so crucial. The thorns, in his framework, represent the actively destructive elements, the actual sins that choke out life. But the core argument he builds from this is that good ground cannot simply be defined as the absence of traffic, stones, and thorns.
Which makes perfect sense when you apply it to literally anything else. I mean, you can't define a truly healthy person purely by the diseases they don't have.
Well, that's a great way to put it.
Yeah, like if I walk into a doctor's office and say, good news, doc, I don't have the flu, my leg isn't broken, and I don't have strep throat, the doctor isn't going to hand me an Olympic medal and declare me a peak athlete.
Right, because true health requires active fuel.
Mm-hmm.
It requires positive working systems, not just a blank slate where disease happens to be absent.
Exactly. And Sexton agrees. He argues that good ground isn't a passive state, it's a complex, active ecosystem.
Yeah, he outlines several specific elements that have to work in tandem. For instance, he brings up location.
Right. Trusting where God planted you.
Mm-hmm. Recognizing that a desert plant will rot in a swamp. But then he connects that to moisture and nutrients, which he equates to natural rain, like seeing God in nature, and active watering, like seeking the Spirit in worship, and of course, the foundational nutrients of Scripture.
Hold on. Having water and having seed doesn't automatically equal a harvest. You can have a warehouse full of seeds and a massive water tank and nothing happens. There had to be a catalyst.
And that is where he introduces the concept of temperature. In this spiritual ecosystem, temperature equates to passion.
Like keeping the fire burning.
Exactly. He uses the biblical narrative of blind Bartimaeus as an illustration. This was a man who didn't just quietly sit by the road hoping for a passive interaction.
He was screaming for Jesus.
Yes, he desperately, loudly cried out for healing, completely ignoring the crowds demanding he stay quiet.
Right.
He generated heat.
Wow, yeah.
If you don't have that temperature, the actual heat and passion of seeking a connection, those nutrients just sit dormant. It's exactly like having seeds in a freezer.
So you have this ecosystem: location, moisture, nutrients, and temperature. And maintenance, right. A farmer constantly plucking weeds so the good areas don't become thorny.
Right, the maintenance is ongoing.
That all sounds very picturesque and, well, logical. But this is where the source material takes that violent turn, because Sexton asks a terrifying question. Why isn't all of that enough?
And it all comes down to the physical state of the surface. Yeah. This transitions us from the ingredients of growth to the violent action of growth. Consider the concrete problem.
Oh, the asphalt analogy?
Yes. You can manufacture the absolute perfect, chemically balanced fertilizer. You can apply the exact optimal amount of water. But if you pour that onto an asphalt parking lot, what is the mechanism of action?
There isn't one. It just pools on the surface and washes down the storm drain.
Precisely. Or think about a natural field that has endured a severe, multi-year drought. The sun bakes that topsoil until it becomes entirely impenetrable.
So it acts just like the asphalt.
Exactly. The ecosystem of nutrients and water is present, but the surface tension completely rejects it.
So the surface has to be violated. It has to be tilled. You have to bring in heavy machinery with massive steel blades and violently rip that hardened earth to shreds. It must be reduced to fragments.
Yes.
And this is the absolute core concept of Sexton's message: brokenness as the fundamental prerequisite for utility.
What's fascinating here is the etymology he brings in to support this. He looks at the Greek word proskuneo,
which is usually translated as worship or submission.
right. But he points out that the root imagery of this word is a dog licking its master's hand.
Oh, man. That is an incredibly visceral, almost uncomfortable image to modern ears. It implies this absolute, unquestioning subservience.
It is meant to be uncomfortable. The underlying mechanism he extracts from that image is the act of doing what is completely unnatural to your own survival instincts in order to please the master.
Huh.
It's the conscious, deliberate decision to override your own human nature.
But I have to push back on that, or at least play devil's advocate for our listeners for a second. We live in a modern culture, especially in American culture, that is built entirely on the mythology of self-sufficiency.
Oh, absolutely. Pulling yourself up by your bootstraps.
Right. And modern psychology constantly reinforces the need to build impenetrable boundaries and fiercely protect your self-esteem. I mean, Sexton specifically calls out the cultural lie that men don't cry, noting how that stoicism is praised. Doesn't this demand for brokenness risk completely destroying a person's sense of self-worth? Is societal pride the main thing creating this concrete over our hearts?
That is a profound friction point between modern individualism and ancient theology. Sexton's framework argues that what modern culture calls self-protection or stoicism is actually just pride acting as a hardening agent.
So the pride is the concrete.
Yes, it is scar tissue forming over the heart. The argument isn't that your value needs to be destroyed, it's that your ego needs to be shattered, because that ego is the asphalt preventing any actual nourishment from reaching your roots.
Okay, that makes sense. But it leads to a very practical dilemma. If breaking our pride goes against every biological and psychological instinct we have for self-preservation, why on earth would anyone ever voluntarily agree to be tilled?
Because the source text presents a stark, unavoidable binary. It is not a question of if the breaking will happen, but how.
Okay, terrifying.
Very. Sexton draws on a metaphor from the book of Matthew, chapter 21, regarding a foundational stone. The theological mechanism is presented as a choice. You can either choose to fall on the stone and be broken, or you can refuse, and eventually the stone will fall on you and grind you to powder.
That is a staggering ultimatum.
It really is. And to illustrate the sheer terror of that involuntary breaking the stone falling on you, Sexton references the historical and biblical account of King Nebuchadnezzar.
Right, the Babylonian king.
Yes. Here was an ancient monarch whose pride was absolute. He built monuments to himself and categorically refused to acknowledge any higher authority.
And the result wasn't just, a bad day at the office.
No, the text describes a total psychological and physical collapse. He is driven away from human society, his mind degrades to that of a beast, his hair grows out like eagle feathers, and his nails become like birds' claws.
Wow.
It's a portrait of absolute catastrophic destruction. The friction of his ego against reality literally ground his humanity to powder.
You know, it makes me think about preventative maintenance on a car.
How so?
Well, you can voluntarily take the car in and let the mechanic break apart the engine to fix a small issue. It's an inconvenience, sure. Or you can ignore the check engine light and wait until the whole engine explodes on the highway at 70 miles an hour.
That is exactly it.
Voluntary brokenness is just spiritual preventative maintenance.
That analogy maps perfectly onto Sexton's argument. You dictate the terms of the braking by actively submitting to it. If you wait for the involuntary brake, the collateral damage is entirely out of your control.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though, because even a controlled voluntary break leaves you with the feeling that you're damaged goods. You feel fragile. But Sexton introduces an analogy that completely reframes the aftermath of this destruction. He brings in the Japanese art of Kintsugi.
Oh, this is a brilliant pivot, moving from the violent imagery of tilling and breaking to the delicate imagery of restoration.
Exactly. For listeners who haven't encountered it, Kintsugi is the centuries-old practice of repairing broken pottery using gold powder. In Western culture, if we drop a bowl, we either throw it in the trash or we try to superglue it back together so the cracks are invisible.
We want to pretend the trauma never happened.
Right. But the Kintsugi artisan does the exact opposite. They use a special lacquer mixed with powdered gold to join the pieces. Instead of throwing the broken item away, the flaws become features. The history of the break becomes the focal point.
And Sexton applies this directly to what we might call the mathematics of grace. He proposes a theological mechanism where every single time a person voluntarily falls on the stone, every time they crush their own pride and repent, God fills that new fracture with pure gold.
So a vessel that shatters once and is repaired has a single beautiful vein of gold running through it. But Sexton pushes this to infinity. He asks the listener to imagine the math on a cosmic scale. What happens if a human being is broken 100,000 times over the course of their life? What if they are broken 1,000,000 times?
The mechanism of continuous repair eventually displaces the original material. If you break and fill a clay pot 1,000,000 times, the fragile ceramic is almost entirely gone.
The vessel has literally been transformed into solid gold.
Yes, the breaking didn't ruin its utility. The breaking was the exact and only mechanism capable of increasing its ultimate value.
I find that incredibly moving because it completely dismantles the shame associated with failing. But he doesn't just leave it at pottery. He brings in a wild animal metaphor that really grounds it. He talks about a wild donkey or horse.
Ah, yes, the concept of chaotic energy versus directed energy.
Right. Because if you see a wild horse galloping across a plain, it looks majestic. It's completely whole and unbroken. But in terms of utility to a farmer or a rider, it is completely useless. It can't pull a plow. It can't carry a messenger. It is only after that animal is quote-unquote broken and tamed that its immense power is actually harnessed.
It has to submit its strength to the will of the rider. And Sexton pairs that with one more incredibly counterintuitive visual, the leaking vessel.
Yes, I love this imagery. Normally, if you buy a cup and it leaks, you return it. A leaking vessel is a failed vessel. But Sexton flips the script. He argues that if you are a completely sealed, pristine, unbroken cup, you contain all the water, all the grace entirely within yourself.
They're a closed loop.
Exactly. You have zero impact on the environment around you. But a broken vessel leaks. It spills the spirit onto everyone it comes into contact with.
But we have to address the mechanical flaw in a leaking vessel, which Sexton is very careful to point out.
Yep.
If your fundamental state is leaking, the math says you will inevitably run dry.
Right. There's a catch. The caveat is that a leaking vessel is only useful if it permanently resides directly beneath the faucet. You have to stay under that constant flow of water so you don't run empty while you're leaking onto everyone else.
So we have established the theoretical beauty of this. We understand the Kintsugi gold, the harnessed power of the horse, the utility of the leaking cup. But cognitive understanding doesn't automatically override human nature.
No, it really doesn't.
How do we practically convince our defensive, ego-driven minds to actually volunteer for the chisel?
And that is the hardest part. Knowing that brokenness is beautiful in theory is great, but the source material argues that you cannot logic your way into this. You need a massive, staggering shift in perspective.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, Sexton utilizes a mental exercise regarding scale that is designed to induce a sense of awe and, frankly, a sense of insignificance. He asks the audience to visualize the Earth. Then scale up to our sun, which could hold over 1,000,000 Earths. Then he pushes further, asking you to imagine a star so incomprehensibly massive that our sun is just a speck. and finally, the entire universe.
Just trying to hold that image in your head makes you feel completely untethered.
That's the intended mechanism, because he then makes the theological claim that to an infinite God, that staggering expanse of the universe is just a grain of sand.
And just when you feel as small as you possibly can, he violently flips the telescope around. He takes you from the macro to the micro. He says, imagine yourself trying to have a deeply personal, intimate conversation with a single virus floating in your bloodstream.
Wow.
Yeah. To an infinite God, we are functionally smaller than that single virus is to us.
I want to pause on that because the philosophical weight of it is immense. The dissonance between the cosmic scale of the creator and the microscopic scale of the created is staggering. Yet the core assertion Sexton makes is that this infinite being possesses the granular awareness to actually know we exist and still cares about us.
It's completely irrational to the human mind. Why would the architect of the cosmos care about a virus? And Sexton adds the final piece of this perspective shift, which delivers the crushing blow to human pride. He forces the listener to confront the literal medical reality of the crucifixion.
It's not just a sanitized story anymore.
No, he urges his listeners to research what a doctor says about the excruciating physical trauma of the cross. Asphyxiation, absolute physical agony.
It's a deliberate confrontation. By juxtaposing the infinite scale of a God who views galaxies as sand against the horrific physical agony of a Roman execution, Sexton constructs his ultimate argument for voluntary brokenness.
He makes the intense claim that every flippant sin, every time we let our ego dictate our actions, we are essentially re-crucifying Christ. When you hold your tiny, fragile ego up against the cosmic scale of the universe and the visceral blood of that sacrifice, your pride doesn't just look bad. It looks absurd.
It looks entirely unjustifiable.
Exactly. And that realization is the ultimate tool to crush our human pride and trigger voluntary brokenness. You break because you finally see how ridiculous it is to remain whole.
So we've traversed from agricultural tilling to the edges of the observable universe to ancient executions. But taking these massive cosmic concepts and applying them to a random Sunday morning, how does this look in real life?
Sexton provides a very clear framework for this, based on a rule of balance. Private brokenness versus public brokenness.
Yes. The ecosystem fails if it's out of balance. If a person only practices private brokenness, meaning they pray, they weep, they humble themselves alone in their closet, but they walk out into the community with an ironclad ego, they fail to edify the church body.
They're a sealed vessel in public.
Right. But the inverse is just as toxic.
Yeah.
If you only display public brokenness, if you're the loudest person crying at the altar, raising your hands where everyone can see your humility, but you have no private discipline behind closed doors, what is that?
It's pure performance. It's shallow.
It's theater. Sexton compares this directly to the historical Pharisees, who manufactured the appearance of piety for social currency.
And when a community actually gets that math right, when the public and private align, Sexton says it triggers what he calls the revival cycle. Because brokenness creates unity.
How so?
Well, imagine two people in a community who completely refuse to break. They both have calcified egos. They both insist they're right. When they interact, what happens mechanically?
It's the equivalent of taking two jagged rocks and smashing them together. Just violent friction.
Exactly. They just bump heads. But if those same two people yield, if they soften their edges and allow their pride to be tilled, suddenly the friction is gone. They connect. And that unity, that chain reaction of authenticity, leads directly to revival.
But Sexton is incredibly practical about how to start this. He explicitly warns against what we might call the New Year's resolution fallacy.
Oh, I found this to be the most relieving part of the entire message.
Right. He tells the audience not to declare some massive radical life overhaul because the human system completely rejects massive sudden shocks.
You burn out in 3 days.
Exactly. Instead, he advocates for a 0.5% increase, micro changes, small steps that slightly disrupt the ego without triggering total defense mechanisms.
He gives such specific low-stakes examples, like if you usually walk into church, put your head down, and rush to your seat to avoid interaction, your 0.5% increase is simply forcing yourself to greet two new people. It's a micro-fracture of your pride.
Or in worship, just raising your hands slightly higher than you did last week.
Yeah, and he even redefines going to the altar. He says, don't wait until you have a personal emergency. Go up to the altar simply to create an atmosphere of worship. Be a leaking vessel. Your mere presence might be the exact environmental shift someone else needs to finally break through.
It shifts the focus from self-preservation entirely to communal edification.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener? We started this deep dive with a mission to redefine what makes ground actually good for growth. And the profound insight here is that feeling broken is not the end of your usefulness.
It is the tilling required for you to be useful at all.
Exactly. And I want to leave our listeners with a final thought to mull over. It builds entirely on that Kintsugi metaphor.
I love this concept.
Think about the people in your life who seem the most spiritually golden, the mentors who are endlessly wise and patient. Our natural instinct is to assume they have lived perfect, unbroken lives.
We assume they are made of solid marble.
But if every break we experience is filled with God's gold, and a vessel broken an infinite amount of times becomes entirely golden, then perhaps those wise people aren't the unbroken ones at all.
Perhaps they are actually the ones who have shattered the most times.
Right. They just simply allowed the master to repair them. What a profound way to completely reevaluate the people we admire and a hopeful way to look at our own cracks.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We hope this exploration is giving you a completely new set of tools for understanding what it actually takes to grow. Until next time, keep seeking the gold in your own cracks.